The Radical. Fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right. You guys ready for another show? All right, welcome everybody. I hope you're having a great week. Thanks for joining me on the Yaron Brook Show this evening. It's Thursday, and it's a surprise show. I didn't announce it. I didn't announce it anywhere on Twitter, Facebook. It's just been a busy day, and I kind of decided, well, I knew I was going to do a show. I announced it on the previous show, but my guess is none of you pay attention to what I say on the previous show about future shows because half the time I don't actually do it. So, hopefully we'll have some live listeners today, but I'm not expecting too many to come. All right, today I want to talk about something I don't know that I've talked much about. We've talked a little bit about it. Obviously, it's implied, and to the extent that you've read Ayn Rand and the extent that you know me, you know it to be true of me. But I don't know. I've never really discussed atheism, so we're gonna be talking about being an atheist. And I purposely didn't put atheism in the title, and I'll talk about why in a minute, because I don't really think there is such a thing as atheism. I don't know what ism there is around atheism, because atheism is not an ideology. But I thought I'd make this kind of personal. I'll talk about me being an atheist and what it means to me and what it affects me. But really, the topic is motivated by an email I got today. An email from a listener who sent me an email of appreciation, and he basically told me his story about how he grew up in a very, very religious household, became less religious in his late teens, but never really abandoned religion. And then he kind of was listening to the standards, I guess, Jordan Peterson and I don't know, all kinds of others online on YouTube. And then one day, he came across my show and became, whoops, I don't know, are you guys on? Okay, it came back. Facebook disappeared and came back. And he said he discovered a short video of mine. I think the famous video of me railing about Europeans' attitudes and generally people's attitudes, the left's attitudes towards sweatshops in China. That video that went viral. And he saw that, and then he said he spent a year just seeing every single video of mine and all the talks and everything. And that led him, of course, to go read Ayn Rand, and he read Ayn Rand, and he fell in love with Ayn Rand, which everybody should, and he really devoted himself to studying her ideas. And he considers himself, I think, an objectivist, and he's studied ideas and tried to integrate them into everything that he does. But he said he really, a few months ago, he encountered this dramatic, painful, horrible situation, and I won't get into the details, but basically a real big decision that had huge impact and sad and depressing and all of that. And there was a temptation kind of at the back of his mind. There was just this temptation of, it wouldn't be cool to believe in God. Wouldn't it be cool to be able to say to yourself, there's a purpose to everything. Even the suffering, there's a purpose. Even the accidents, even the bad stuff that happens in life, isn't it? There's a purpose. Something good will come of it. We're destined to fill in the blank, or any mystical cliche that's out there that is an attempt to kind of just make it easier to cope with, difficult times. And I think a lot of people tend to be religious in difficult times. There's that saying, everybody believes in God in the trenches, which is nonsense, but you can understand that, right? When your life is on the line, you want to believe there's an afterlife. That's pretty cool if there's an afterlife. It's pretty cool if you don't get to die. And you want to believe that there's a purpose to it all, that the suffering, to the death, to the destruction, to the stupidity, to the idiocy, to the immorality, to the evil. That there's some grand plan, there's some great purpose. And he said it was a real test, right? A real test of his commitment to reason, his commitment to objectivism, which really is a commitment to reason. And you know, he says that he passed in the sense that he rejected all the mysticism. He faced the situation. And at the end of the day, he's come out of it and coming out of it fine and healthy and content and really kind of with peace. And you know, it's still sad. He can't change that. But one of the things he was saying is, how do objectivists deal with it? And how do atheists deal with it? Right? And that made me think, yeah, I mean, there's an important point there, and I'm going to get to that later on, about how you deal with situations like that, and what I think to some extent is missing from objectivism that would help us deal with situations like that. But and I'll talk a little bit about that, and I think I've talked about it in the past. But more importantly, I want to talk, it reminded me of, yeah, I mean, there's a certain challenge in being an atheist, and I'll tell you a story from my personal life where this was, you know, one of the few where it popped up. And I'll just talk about what atheism kind of means to me, and then I'm curious what it means to you, and if any of you want to share that in the super chat. Now, let me just note that the super chat is, again, as usual, I'm going to try to answer questions that are related to the topic, and delay the questions that are not related to the topic to the end. So I see the first question is about North Korea. We're going to delay that to the end, and I'll cover that in the end. But the second question is related, but let me get to that. It's still, I wouldn't say, you know, that the question is related directly to what I have to say. So let me just tell you my story. I think I don't think it's particularly interesting, but it at least tells you a little bit about me and my attitude. And then I want to make some more general points about atheism. But let me just say, you know, to a large extent, I don't get the alternative to atheism. That is, I don't get the idea of God, or I don't get the idea of religion as a thing, as a state of mind, as a way to engage with the world. And to a large extent, that's because almost from the time I can remember myself, I've been an atheist. And what all atheism means to me, and all atheism really means, I think, is that you don't believe in God, or that you know, I think a more sophisticated interpretation. You don't believe in the mystical. You reject the mystical. You reject mystical explanations for anything, and you don't accept things on faith. But for me, originally, it was basically this question of God, and you know, at the time that I stopped believing in God, and that was, I was between the ages of 6 and 7, somewhere around that. I know, because I know where it happened in the world, and it was in London, and we were in London when I was around 6 to 8, right? So I remember that it's sometime during that period. And really since that age, so basically I was going to a very religious school at the time. You know, if you know Judaism, we wore yarmulkes to school, and we wore the kind of stuff you wear under the shirt, and you prayed in school, and you did all the stuff. And I basically woke up one morning and said to myself, not to anybody else, this doesn't make any sense. This is stupid. This is ridiculous. We'd been studying that if you see God, you die, and all this other stuff. And Moses, he was the only human being to actually see God. And I mean, all these contradictions were in my mind about all these things, about what kind of God is this? Why would he have these different commandments? Why would you be allowed to do this and not allowed to do that? And I don't know. I was 6 years old, so how sophisticated of a thinker could I have been? But it was like, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. This is silly. And that was it. And, you know, I've never, since the age of 6, never thought about it. I mean, I've thought about it in the sense that it's just only been reinforced. I've thought about it in the sense that I've defended my position even in school. I remember in grade school, you know, arguing with kids about the existence of God. But it just was, this is silly. It doesn't make any sense. These books were written a long time ago. Why should I believe anything written in them? And why, you know, what evidence is there of this, some kind of super being? that lives in the sky or lives somewhere or lives everywhere. I don't know. But none of it made any sense to me. And of course, he knows everything and he knows what's going to happen, but you have free will. All of that. I don't know how much of it I absorbed when I was 6, how much of it I could understand, whether logic, how big of a role logic played in my mind at the age of 6, but enough to say, this makes no sense, this is silly, and move on. And, I went through the motions of religion for a long time because that's what was expected in the family. So I kept going to the religious school. We prayed every Friday night over dinner. I had a bar mitzvah. I used to go with my grandfather to synagogue. So I went to synagogue until I was, I don't know, I think until my, at least until 18, I think, until I went to the army, and maybe I went after that once or twice with my grandfather because it was a value to him and I liked to hang out with him. He was a really cool guy. But no, I never believed in it. Of course, the more I studied, the more I went to synagogue, the more I actually thought about the words I was mouthing and the words that were in the books, the more convinced I was that this was silly and it had no merit. And then, of course I read Ayn Rand, and Ayn Rand put into words with regard to religion, nothing else. In every aspect of her philosophy, Ayn Rand was a complete revolution, an intellectual revolution for me. I disagreed with everything Ayn Rand said when I first read Atlas Shrugged. Everything. I disagreed about capitalism. I disagreed about egoism. I disagreed really about everything above reason. I disagreed. With religion, Ayn Rand just put words into, I guess, what I'd always thought, and she just gave it a foundation, and she gave it a philosophical context and a philosophical explanation, and she, I always was committed to reason, but more implicitly, and she made it explicit. She gave me the knowledge to make it explicit, my dedication and my commitment to reason, and the idea of reason is the only source of knowledge, and reason is your basic means of survival. All of that was completely new to me, and only affirmed my not taking religious seriously and never having taken religious seriously in my life. So I start from the premise of religion was never a thing for me, and I've never understood religion, and I've never understood how religion is a thing for people. And I remember coming to the U.S. for the first time, and in 1987, and meeting objectivists for the first time, American objectivists for the first time, and discovering how important religion was to them. They were overcoming it. They were getting over it. But it was a big deal to get over it, right? It was so ingrained. I think American culture has got religion in so many different elements and so many different aspects ingrained into it, that it was part of becoming an objectivist is getting rid of the religious baggage that you've been brought up with. And this is what the guy who wrote me the email was expressing, is that all those religion voices, all those religious ideas in a time of crisis came back as a temptation. And he resisted it, but it was there. It was in his subconscious. And to me, it was never there because, again, I'd rejected it so early. And Israeli culture, I discovered, was so much more secular in important, significant ways than American culture. That is, in American culture, religion is massively important. Even the secular parts of American culture, I think religion is far more significant and important and debated and discussed than it was in Israel. In Israel, it was like, you don't want to be religious, who cares? You're an atheist, who cares? You debated it in school because you debated everything in school, but it wasn't like... And Israeli society, the other thing about Israeli society is it's very segregated around this. Then you didn't encounter very, very religious people unless you went to find them, right? You weren't in a school with very religious people. One of the things I say, one of the benefits of Judaism that I like is that people advertise in the way that they dress and in what they put on their head how religious they are, right? So somebody wearing a yarmulke is religious. If it's a certain type of yarmulke, he's more religious. If it's like a big black hat and he's got black clothes and he's got his hair in a particular way, he's super religious. So you can actually, when you sit down next to somebody in a plane and he's Jewish, you can kind of tell. And if they're not wearing yarmulke, they're probably secular. And a large percentage of secular Jews are atheists. So Jews advertise their religiosity. Christians don't. I've had some of the most bizarre experiences that really shocked me, sitting next to people in airplanes and having a normal conversation, thinking the person next to me was completely normal. And then, suddenly they start on some path about, I need to find Jesus or whatever. Or if they're Mormon, a Mormon thing, and they're suddenly evangelizing, and you go, oh my God, this person seemed, in my mind, he didn't seem religious. There was nothing to indicate this was happening. And because I'm so used to, we're Jews, there's no question, right? You know exactly what you're going to get. You know exactly what's coming. Anyway, that I've always found that interesting. Let me just see. No, this is okay. So I was surprised when I came to the U.S. the extent to which religion had a grip on the culture and played a huge role in the culture, and is constantly debated among people, constantly discussed. When the new atheist phenomena came out, Dawkins and Hitchens and Sam Harris, the popularity of those people, but also the backlash and the debate about it. When I was growing up, the new atheist would have been nothing, a blimp. There was nothing new. There was nothing I didn't find. It was interesting only in the context of American culture, but there was nothing dramatically new about what they were saying. It was just that it was coming out at a point in time, post 9/11, and it was coming out at a particular point in American culture where George Bush was very religious and emphasizing religion that made it interesting. But, the arguments about the existence of God, been there a long, long, long time ago. So that's kind of my background. I'll give you one other little story of a situation where it wasn't that religion tempted me, but I kind of understood why some people are tempted. What was it about religion, or at least what was it about one aspect of religion that tempted people? Because, again, I don't understand it generally. I find the whole idea of this existence of God and a God and to pray to a God and God that intervenes in your daily life. I find it just so irrationally bizarre that I can't take it really seriously. And I apologize, but I have low tolerance for these kind of issues because I just don't take them seriously. But but this is a story. So I remember when one of my sons was, I think he was 4 or 5, maybe 4. Yeah, I think it was 4. He was something about 4, and he watched a lot of movies back then. We used to watch movies, and he came to me and he said something like in the movies we always emphasized that the people who died were the bad guys, and he asked me something like, only bad guys die, right? Like as a broad statement, not in terms of movies, but just a broad statement about life. Only bad guys die. Now, wow. Now I've got a 4, 5-year-old who I need to explain that, no. Not only bad guys die, indeed, everybody dies. And it's true that usually bad guys die violent deaths, but sometimes even good guys die violent deaths. And we discussed what good guys are and what bad guys are and so on. And at some point I'm saying, everybody dies. And I said something like, I'll die one day, but it's a long, long time from now. Don't worry. And suddenly he burst out crying, right? Really crying. And I thought, oh my God, I've scared him, and he thinks I'm going to die, and he's worried about me dying. And just show you how self-centered I am. And And so I'm telling him it's going to be a long time. You'll be a grandfather before I die, whatever. It's way in the future. And, to the extent that a 4-year-old even understand what future is and how to measure stuff. And he keeps on crying, and it's not stopping. And finally, I try to get him to tell me why he's crying, and he says, what he's really crying about is not because I'm going to die. He suddenly realized that he was going to die. Right? And that's what he was crying about. And it was that moment, the thing that went through my mind is, wow, religious people have it so easy. All they have to tell this little kid now is, don't worry, when you die, you go to heaven, and you'll see me and everybody else, and it'll be a great time, and da-da-da-da-da, all the fantasy nonsense that religion teaches about death. And isn't this so easy to stop him from crying and to stop him from being afraid? And of course, it just hit me that the temptation that people must have to this, it was never a real temptation. I went in and explained to him the finality of life and so on, and he cried it out, and that was it. We never had a conversation about it again, and he's never been anything but an atheist, and I don't think he's ever had any questions about religion or the existence of God. That was just it, and it passed. Reality is what it is, and it's sometimes scary and strange and sad, maybe, but it is what it is, and that's the context in which you live, and that's the context in which you function, and it's the context in which you do the best that you can to live the best life that you can. Last 2 episodes we've been talking about living the best life that you can and how to do that, right? So that, that's kind of another story, if you will. So atheism, in my view, really gives you nothing other than religion is wrong in that it requires faith. God doesn't exist. Mysticism is invalid. Using faith as a source for knowledge is invalid. And that's it. It doesn't even tell you the positive. It doesn't really, I don't think, tell you that the proper means to knowledge is human reason. The proper means to knowledge is observing reality and using your mind to integrate and to understand the world around you by the use of your mind and your ability to know the world through observation. It's not a philosophy, and in that sense, it's not an ism. It's not even an ideology, never mind a philosophy. And this is why so many people are confused when you say atheism, because unfortunately they immediately associate it with some kind of ideology. And unfortunately, usually, and this is one of the great damages that the right has done, they associate it with the ideology of the left. They associate it with communism and socialism when it has nothing to do with communism and socialism. And indeed, I don't even believe communists were atheists in the real sense, because they were mystics. They were a different type of mystic, but they were still mystics. They were people of faith, not people of reason, or not. They didn't reject faith. They just changed what they were faithful in, what they chose to believe without evidence in. And I think a lot of people are religious who claim to be atheist in a sense that they believe using faith in things that have no basis in reality. Right. Now, Jason says, if you want to be religious, fine. If you want to be an atheist, fine. As long as you don't shove your ideas down my throat, who cares? Well, I care. I do care. My attitude is not, if you want to be religious, fine. If you want to be an atheist, fine. I mean, certainly politically, I don't believe the government should dictate whether you should be religious or whether you should be atheist. But I think there are far-reaching consequences socially and ultimately to the use of coercion in society, whether society is a society that is focused on religion or society that is not. And I think to the extent that a society takes religion seriously, to that extent it's a society that's going to be attracted to the use of coercion and attracted to the use of force and ultimately attracted to authoritarianism. So I think it matters whether my neighbor is religious or not, and that's why I think it's worth spending time trying to convince people not to be religious, but not just not to be religious for the sake of a vacuum, for the sake of the abyss, intellectually, ideologically, but for the sake of an alternative, secular, rational, reason-based philosophy. So being an atheist for its own sake is meaningless. Being an atheist as part of adopting a set of ideas to guide your life, that is what is important. That is what is meaningful. That is what one should strive to get your neighbors. My neighbor's philosophy is important to me. Not because I believe I should cram my philosophy down their throat. I don't believe in cramming anything down anybody's throat. But because their philosophy will guide how they live, which will have some impact on me, and how they vote, which definitely has an impact on me, how productive they are, which definitely has an impact on me, how much they want to trade or not, which has an impact on me. So other people's lives does have an impact on me. Their philosophy does have an impact on me. Whether they're religious or not does have an impact on me. I would like to live in a religion-free world in which people have adopted a rational philosophy and a rational morality. And they've adopted it because they understand it and it makes sense to them. And it's the right thing. It's the way they believe they should live. So atheism in and of itself is just the recognition that there is no meaning, there's no significance to the concept of God. There is no meaning or significance to mysticism, to ideas around mysticism. Now, let me say one positive thing about, and that's why you can be an atheist and a capitalist, an atheist and a socialist, an atheist and a Kantian, an atheist and anything. I mean, you can be, atheism just is the negation of something. It's not the positive of anything. And I don't think it's enough to be an atheist. I think you have to have a positive view of life. And I think atheists, and this is why atheists gravitate towards some intellectual view, and many of them gravitate towards socialism, which is sad, because that's kind of one of the few alternatives out there. What was I going to say? I was going to say something about, about religion, about a positive on religion. The one positive religion has is Ayn Rand called religion a primitive form of philosophy. Human beings need guidance. Not everybody's going to invent philosophy from scratch. Indeed, almost nobody is going to invent philosophy from scratch. Very, very few people are going to actually be able to figure out how to live by themselves. Ayn Rand and 3 other people maybe in history, right? Very, very few people are going to actually come up with a set of ideas to help guide their life. And we need guidance. We need a system of principles to help us make sense of the complex world out there. We need moral principles. We need to know what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. Now, so 99.999999% of the people cannot do this by themselves. Then there's another big percentage of people, particularly in the world we live in today, who just want to be told how to behave. And I have to say, I don't really have any respect for these people, and I don't really, but they don't want to, just tell them. And just tell them means, I don't know, the majority tells them, the people in authority tells them, the people who have the morality halo around them tell them. Somebody has to tell them how to behave. And they're just followers. And a certain percentage of humanity seems to be, certainly today, maybe it's an overwhelming majority of people, are followers. They don't even study. They're religious not because they've studied religion and they think it's a good thing. They're religious because their parents were religious. I mean, I love it. Catholics advocate for Catholicism, but The only reason they're Catholics is because their parents were Catholic. And Jews advocate for Judaism, but the only reason they're Jewish is because their parents were Jewish. And evangelicals advocate for evangelicalism or whatever, but that's just because their parents... I mean, at the very least, if you're going to be religious, study all the religions, immerse yourself in it, and choose the one that makes the most sense. But it's not about making sense, is it? It's about an authority telling you what to do. So, there's this whole group of people that follows. Now, I would rather they follow mindlessly irrational philosophy because they will hurt me less than if they follow an irrational philosophy, even though they're just followers and they're never going to get fully the rational philosophy. So I have a strong interest in the followers just following a rational philosophy. But then the most important group and the most interesting group, because it's the group you can actually influence and the group that actually has influence, I think, in the world, beyond the creators of philosophies. They're very, very rare, very unusual, but everybody else who matters are people who think for themselves. People who are going to study ideas, figure out at whatever level they can. And some are going to become philosophers, but others are going to be Riordans or Dagneys, and they're going to study, understand philosophy up to a point, enough for them to get the guidance they need to live. But they're not going to be guided through faith, through blind obedience. They're going to understand it. They're going to integrate it. They're going to check to see if it's true. And then they're going to live. And that's the people you care about. That's the people who matter. That's the people who ultimately will shape the culture. And that's the people who ultimately, the followers, follow. So here the idea is, not everybody is going to study Ayn Rand's philosophy the way philosophers do, objectivist philosophers do. Not everybody's going to even study it to the extent I have. But many of you should and do study the philosophy to the extent that you understand the premise, you get the guidance, you integrate the guidance, you find the guidance that it provides, the moral guidance that it provides, as non-contradictory. You find it makes sense, it's rational. It enhances your life, it works for you, and you go and you practice it, and you live it. And that's what Objectivism is about. It's not about studying, it's about living the philosophy. So, as I said, religion provides people with a primitive form of philosophy. But people need a philosophy. Everybody needs. The followers, the thinkers, everybody needs a philosophy. And if they abandon religion, then they're going to gravitate towards something else. And that something else, usually for most people, is the thing that's being taught, the thing that is dominant in the universities, the thing that the intellectuals are preaching, the thing that is in the culture. And today, that secular philosophy is, and ranges from anything from, Plato to Kant to postmodernism to Marxist to Hegelian to whatever. A mishmash of a lot of different things. To the kind of not quite religious, but not quite atheist Jordan Peterson. The incomprehensible mishmash that is his metaphysics and epistemology. Right? But people need ideas. They need guidance. They need principles. Even if the principles are simple, like tidy your room and stand up straight. They need to have some kind of guidance. This is good, this is bad. Jordan Peterson does a great job. One of my favorite Jordan Peterson's things, topics that he talks about is the evil of lying, the evil of dishonesty, and why dishonesty is so destructive to yourself, to your own psychology, to your own ability to live, to your own ability to create, to your own ability to thrive. I mean, he has this wonderful thing, and I think he shows Pinocchio, and he goes on and on about it, and he has some observations that is very unique, and at the level that I've only heard from some objectivists talk about dishonesty like that. He integrates it beautifully. So that's the one topic I really like Jordan Peterson on. And people need to be told, or more importantly, people need to understand that they should be honest. And, you know, it's when they don't have any ideas, when they don't have a philosophy, that's when things get very scary. That's the nihilism that we see all around us. That's no guidance, no right or wrong, smash everything, destroy everything. Or when the guidance is so pathetic, it's so weak, it's so stupid, it's so collectivist, it's so undemanding or demanding of horrible things, then nihilism seems like the most appealing, most attractive thing that one can do. So, if you reject religion, if you reject God, you have to adopt something. And most people adopt kind of the secular philosophy out there. And indeed, what's happening in America and what's certainly happening in Europe, is even the people who are still religious, almost none of them are seriously religious. They're kind of religious on Sundays. They're religious in certain aspects of the subconscious. They're religious in some of the values they've internalized. But to a large extent, they're religious. To a large extent, they're religious in a part of their mind, and they have adopted and absorbed secular philosophies from the culture. But everybody out there, I mean, this is an observation Ayn Rand made. Everybody has a philosophy. Everybody. That philosophy could be religion. That philosophy could be a mishmash of religion and secular stuff. It could be just secular stuff. But everybody has a philosophy. And most people, the overwhelming majority of people, that philosophy is just implicit. They've never thought about it. They've never articulated it. They've never really put it to the test. They've never considered it. They've never really chosen it. They've absorbed it from the culture, from their environment, from their teachers, from what they've heard, from TV shows, from whatever, books they've read. So, there's a massive vacuum for people once they decide to leave religion and once they decide to give up on God. And one of the, I think, big flaws of the new atheists was that they didn't and couldn't provide guidance. They didn't really provide an ethical, moral alternative. I mean, to some extent, they had a certain sense of epistemology and certainly a metaphysics. They certainly had a commitment to reality and to science and to using reason. But it wasn't clear what exactly they meant by reason. It wasn't clear that what they exactly meant by science and reality and the scientific method. None of those terms are really, really well defined by any of them, and to the extent that they tried to define them, they're not very good. But the big flaw of the atheist movement is that it doesn't provide positive guidance. And when it does provide positive guidance, the positive guidance tends to be just rehashed religion when it comes to morality. It tends to be just, live for others, be an atheist, be nice to your neighbor, there's no real rethinking going on of morality from an atheist, secular perspective. The only person who really has done that is Ayn Rand. I mean, Sam Harris, to a large extent, his religion is a rehash of Christianity. To a large extent, he's bought into, and certainly, Dawkins is a huge advocate for altruism, which you get straight from Christianity. Now, it's also true that you get the altruism from secular philosophers who, to their great discredit, and in my view, what should be to their great shame, right, still, also did the same thing, just rehashed religion into a secular philosophy. Ayn Rand's genius is that she really was willing to question, one of her genius, in many ways she's genius, but one of the things was she was willing to question everything. She was willing to challenge everything. She was willing to uproot everything. And that takes a huge amount of courage. A huge amount of courage to really uproot the prevailing ideas, the prevailing, knowledge, the prevailing philosophies, everything in the culture. And that's what people like Jordan Peterson don't do. That's what people like Zizek and all the conventional intellectuals out there, successful and unsuccessful, don't do that. They're just rehashing existing stuff. Now, there's nothing wrong with rehashing existing stuff. If it's true, all I do is rehash existing stuff, but I rehash Ayn Rand's existing stuff, so it tends to be true. All right, we've got a bunch of super chat questions. So let me start going over them. It's a funny one because, I'll do this one because it's short, but it's funny. The question is, can you discuss Hinduism at some length? That's quite a question. No, I can't. How can I discuss Hinduism? I know almost nothing about Hinduism. I can't discuss Hinduism at some shortness. All I can say about Hinduism is it strikes me as a pretty crazy secular religion. I know a tiny bit about Buddhism. I know nothing about Hinduism. Yeah, that's it. It's another religion with its mysticism. I will say this, and this is safe spaces. So I should warn you that I'm going to trigger you all. All kinds of microaggressions are going to happen right now. Hinduism strikes me as a pretty primitive religion, and a religion that was not deeply and in any kind of significant way touched by Aristotle, and that is, and the consequence of that is that people in Hindu countries, beyond a certain point, didn't really advance much. Civilization could not move very far. The same with Buddhism. The same with Chinese philosophy. The reason I believe that Western civilization advanced as far as it did, and Chinese civilization and Hindu civilization, which were more advanced than the West at certain points in time, the reason that Western civilization advanced so far and had ultimately a Renaissance and Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution is because it adopted, even from the beginning, elements of Greek philosophy. So even the original Christians at least had Plato, at least had Plato's kind of wondering about the world and debating and discussing and thinking and engagement with the world in that sense. But the real thing that moved the West towards civilization is Aristotle and the introduction of Aristotle's thinking into Western civilization with Thomas Aquinas, who, because he took it seriously, brought it into the Catholic Church, and from then it was just an issue of time. And I would say Jews Jewish culture has been a healthy, relatively speaking, healthy culture and a relatively speaking healthy religion. Relative, right? Because Jews integrated Aristotle early on as well. That is, Jewish philosophers relatively early, that is, certainly from Maimonides onwards, that is Maimonides, I think, is the 13th century on, there was a certain Aristotelian attitude. And really, if you go back to the Talmud, the Talmud is a you would think it was heavily, I don't know the history, but you'd think it was heavily influenced by the Greeks, because it's very kind of disputational attitude that the Jews had. Everything was disputed. Everything was questioned. There was really this Socratic dialogue that's going on in the Talmud. And I really would have to look and see what happened first, Greece or the Talmud. But I suspect the Talmud was influenced by these Greek philosophers. And it's almost got this commitment to reality and to common sense and to logic in some primitive form. So Judaism has always, at least since the Talmudic times, has been grounded in reality, grounded in logic to some extent, maybe not formal logic, but to some extent logic, in a way that Christianity was not, because it was so heavily influenced by Plato. And it was so much more mystical and altruistic than Judaism was. Judaism was much more this worldly, and therefore much more inclined towards logic and towards disputation. There wasn't quite the same dogma that was particularly imposed by the Catholic Church under Constantine and later. In Judaism, everything is debated. Nothing is settled. And that created a much healthier culture in terms of Judaism. And I think those are the reasons why Judaism and ultimately the Christian world developed in the way that they developed, and developed in a much more healthy way than did Eastern religions, which never had Aristotle. They never had reason. Their epistemology was never grounded in reality. Both Hinduism, Confucianism, Taoism, all the kind of Buddhism, all the kind of philosophical influences on Eastern philosophy, at least to the extent that I'm aware of them, and I'm not an expert here, none of them have an epistemology of this world. They all have an epistemology of another world, of a kind of a superstitious epistemology, of mystical forces fighting it out, that you are a pawn within the fight. They don't have a conception of a reality grounded in this world and an epistemology, reason, that can understand and absorb it. All right, let's take some of these. Let's take some of these questions. That's fine, and go over them. Okay, that's not relevant right now. Okay, that's less really. Here's the question. This is a good question. If religion is bad, why are religious people so happy? Are they? Really? I don't know how you got to the point where religious people are so happy. I mean, certainly some religious people seem to be happy. Many religious people are not happy. I mean, I know more about religious Jews than I do about religious Christians. But yeah, there's some religious Jews who sometimes are happy. And they certainly, in certain religious parts of Judaism, certain ultra-Orthodox parts of Judaism, they emphasize happiness. They work on happiness. They try to express happiness. But are they really happy? Really hard to tell. I doubt it. But why are religious people? So let's think first historically. Historically, I think when religious people were really religious, in other words, when religious people took their religions really seriously, when they really tried to apply it, where they lived it day to day and day in, day out, I think they were miserable. Everything was a sin. They were sinful from the beginning, in a sense. There was original sin. And they feared going to hell or to heaven. They feared every action that they took. They had they groveled before the cross at the church. But life was generally miserable, and maybe the church was an escape. Life sucked, and the church at least provided some beauty and some calmness and maybe some pretty hymns and some comfort, given how bad life was. But I wouldn't say they were happy. Today, I'd say this. I think you're happy to the extent that you're rational. You're happy to the extent that you have rational values and you pursue rational values. And some people, many religious people indeed, are not very religious. They mouth it, they speak it, they internalize some of it. But in their day-to-day lives, in much of their relationships, and certainly in the most important part of their life when it comes to self-esteem and happiness in their productive work, they're not religious. They don't do engineering on faith. They don't build bridges on faith. They're committed to reason, rationality, facts, reality, science. And to the extent that they commit themselves to facts, reality, science, to that extent, they're happy. They also have, it's true, they value other people. They value relationships with other people, which I think does add to one's joy in life, getting that visibility with other people. They tend to congregate around people who share their values, which I think help. But I also think that the values undercut, the religious values undercut the secular source of their ultimate happiness. So that ultimately, later in life, as they get older, so many of them become bitter, so many of them become angry, so many of them feel guilty, so many of them feel fear. And I don't think they are happy in a sense of, a state of joy, of a sense of non-contradiction, not living a contradiction, a sense of no real metaphysical, if you will, stress. I think they're very stressed. And I don't think they're truly happy in that sense. So again, their happiness is limited. It's bounded by how much they are rational, to what extent that they're rational, and many of them are not, and therefore they're not. So I don't get the how happy they are. I mean, read biographies of people who've escaped from religion, who've abandoned religion, who've left religion, and what they describe about, or see some stories about the ultra-Orthodox, or how they live, or the Mormons, in their little cults or whatever, in their little communes. So it's not pretty. It's not at all. I'm actually watching a movie. I haven't finished this. I didn't want to comment on it, and I can't remember its name right now. But it says somebody who leaves a very religious family to go pursue science and is condemned by the family for doing that. I mean, those people are not happy. They're miserable. They're miserable. Because to the extent that you're religious, to that extent you negate reality. And to the extent that you negate reality, you're going to be miserable. To the extent that you are irrational, you're going to be miserable. This one's an easy one. What's my explanation for reincarnation? What's my view on reincarnation? The Dalai Lama has been reincarnated 14 times. How can I explain that, or is it a fraud? Well, of course it's a fraud. I mean, it's a completely ridiculous. There's no science behind reincarnation. There's no proof of reincarnation. How do you know the Dalai Lama has been reincarnated 14 times? Because he says so. You can't prove it. There is no, they can't prove it. And indeed, none of this mystical stuff stands up to any kind of scientific evaluation. It's complete bunk. It's complete nonsense. So, no, there is no reincarnation. How would you know? I mean, supposedly, if you're Buddhist, you could reincarnate into a cockroach. I mean, that's what they live in fear of. You're supposed to be moral in this life, so you don't reincarnate into a cockroach. So, but if you aren't reincarnated in a cockroach, you're not even conscious. Cockroaches don't even have a consciousness, I don't think. Maybe they're conscious, I don't know. But you certainly wouldn't know. So the whole thing is silly. It's just so silly that it sounds so ridiculous that it somehow convinces some people. It's gobbledygook. It doesn't mean anything. And again, it seems like most religions are trying to cope with the idea of death. Most religions are trying to cope with the idea of death. Because I think death, as Jordan Peterson says, is a big deal. It's important. And the way religion deals with death is, there is no death. You either go to heaven, or you reincarnate into something else, or something happens. So the way religion deals with death is it denies it. It rejects it. It makes it non-existent. You don't actually die. You continue to exist. You just change forms. And it's interesting that every religion does it a little differently. Judaism, and one of the ways Judaism is more this worldly than other religions is there is no afterlife in Judaism. At least in the Old Testament. There's no afterlife. There's no heaven or hell. There's nothing in Judaism in the Old Testament about going to hell or going to heaven. You die. You're gone. You're finished. Right? And that's my perspective on death. Yeah, death is important. Something to be avoided. Something to be delayed. You can't avoid it completely, so you delay it. But I don't view it like Jordan Peterson views it. Oh, it's this ominous presence that by its very existence makes life hard and difficult and suffering and painful, and you always know you're going to die. There's always that risk. Death is always just around the corner, and therefore, you have to internalize this malevolent view of the world, which Jordan Peterson has done and teaches to a large extent, and he tries to help people overcome it. But it's the essential thing. Suffering is the essence of life, and suffering is the essence of life. Why, according to Jordan Peterson? Because death is right there. But my view of death is, yeah, all right, you die one day. That's the reason to live. There's only existence and non-existence. There's only life and non-life. You have life. Make the most of it. Don't, try to delay non-life as much as you can. But while you're alive, the most important thing to do is enjoy it. Be happy. Be successful. Have fun. I mean, deep fun, real fun, important fun. Not frivolous fun, because frivolous fun doesn't last very long, and sometimes frivolous fun gets you closer to death. So the existence of death first of all, once you understand what life is, it's kind of death has to be there, right? Ayn Rand explains this. You can't really have values unless you have death, because what makes values necessary, what makes it necessary to pursue some things and avoid other things, is that the other things are harmful to me. The other things would cause me damage, and damage ultimately is the essence of death. So it is the fact that we can go out of existence that makes the pursuit of values necessary. And the pursuit of values is fun. It's good for you. It makes life. So I can't think of a life without pursuing values. It would be boring. It would be stupid. It would be, who would care? You wouldn't care. So death is a necessity. And as a necessity, it's a metaphysical existence. It's just something you accept. It's just there. It just is. And then, as a consequence, you don't avoid pain. It's not about avoiding pain. It's not about avoiding death. It's about living. Your whole orientation should be not, I should avoid pain. Your whole orientation should be, I should embrace pleasure. The whole orientation should be, move towards pleasure, move towards good, move towards joy, move towards happiness. Pain is a minor issue. And sometimes you don't avoid pain. You go to the dentist. Sometimes you get a shot. Sometimes pain is part of the pursuit of pleasure. Sometimes pain is part of the pursuit of health, of life, of living. But the focus is not pain. The focus is life. What are the requirements of my life? What are values necessary for me to live successfully? How do I use my mind to live the life the best that I can live? That's what I need to do. That's what I'm going to do. That's my focus. That's what you should spend your awake minutes thinking about. Not death and avoiding pain and suffering and so on. But life. Life. How to live. It's not simple. It's not straightforward. It's not obvious how to live. It requires real thinking, real effort. All right. More questions. They're rolling in. You might have to slow down because I'm not sure there's enough hours in the day for me to make it all. If you can name the greatest danger in believing in God, what would it be? Well, the greatest danger in believing in God is epistemological. It's the acceptance of something without evidence. That is incredibly corrupting to your mind. It's incredibly corrupting to your understanding of what is true, what is knowledge, where to find knowledge, how to find knowledge, what counts as knowledge. Once you get a small element of faith into your thinking, it will corrupt everything else. It will infect you in other ways. Now, I have a whole talk. I'm actually going to give it in Dallas, Texas, at a conference in a week and a half about how religion is fundamentally authoritarian and how religion is anti-freedom. And, you know, that's part of the danger of believing in God. Is that then, if you believe in God, then you believe in everything He says. Everything people tell you He says. And then knowledge to you is not what you see, what you observe, and what you figure out through logic based on those observations. Knowledge to you is what God says. And when God says, go kill your eldest son, you go, yes, sir. I go kill my eldest son. And what that is that is moral authoritarianism. That is, it's good, it's moral to kill your eldest son if God says so, because God is the standard of morality. Wow, that is sick. That is dangerous. So religion tells you, here are 10 commandments. You don't have to think. You don't have to understand why. Just follow these commandments. Just do it. Religion, the belief in God, is fundamentally anti-thinking. The belief in God is fundamentally anti your own moral choices. It's anti-using logic to discover truth. And therefore, religion is dangerous for your own ability to think. That has consequences about how you acquire knowledge. That has consequences in terms of whether you accept authoritarianism or not. And I think religious cultures are much more likely to become authoritarian. I don't think it's an accident that communism succeeded in Russia, a very religious culture. And I don't think it was an accident that fascism was successful in a relatively religious, mystical culture, which was Germany, with its intellectual foundations and kind of a secularization of religion. But its cultures, religion inculcates authoritarianism into people's thinking, and once you inculcate authoritarianism into people's thinking, then it's easy to inculcate authoritarianism into the politics. So believing in God is dangerous for you because it destroys your capacity to think objectively. It makes it very hard for you to achieve happiness, because happiness is a function of how rational you are. And ultimately it can lead to political authoritarianism. Only that. Other than that, it's not too dangerous. That was a joke. All right. Many people my age, I don't know what that age is, but many people my age believe in zodiac and other supernatural happenings instead of religion. Would discovery of reason help them become more individualistic and more rational? I don't know. Because believing in the zodiac and supernatural happenings is just so silly. It's just so nuts. I mean, at least religion attempts to provide you with justification, with bodies of scholarly work to justify their positions, with history and tradition on their side, and with a primitive form of philosophy to guide your life. They at least give you something. They provide you with some guidance. Believing in supernatural happenings and zodiacs and whatever is just silliness on steroids. It's just nuts. It has no connection to reality. And the fact that it doesn't have any connection to reality is evident to almost anybody. So the only people who, I think, ultimately believe in this stuff are people who don't want to think, who ignore reality, who are looking to escape from facts and from logic. Now, I don't know if you can help them discover reason, because I don't know that they want to discover reason. Because this suggests to me a certain laziness and a certain wanting to escape from what logic and reason require. So I don't know. I mean, it's really sad if a lot of young people are into this nonsense, and they maybe they play around with it for a year or a few months, but to be committed to such nonsense is crazy. How would you explain the objectivity of Ayn Rand's morality to a moral relativist who argues that it's just your opinion? I mean, it's hard, and it requires explaining. It's hard to do on one foot, but I would certainly say something like this. What is good for you or what is not good for you is objective. It's not subjective. And the obvious example of that is poison. Cyanide is bad for you. Unequivocally. Generally, fruit, not overconsumption, but a little bit of fruit is with vitamins and nutrients and stuff, is good for you. Right? And we scientifically know that that's true. And it's not subjective. It's not you decide, I truly believe cyanide is going to be good for me. And you take cyanide, well, you know the consequences. Cyanide is bad for you, period. Now, the same is true of spiritual values. Certain things are good for you and certain things are bad for you. And that is knowable to you. Actually, to some extent, more so than nutrition, which is a science in its infancy that seems to be lacking in objective knowledge. But for example, look around you. Look objectively around you. Do people who systematically lie succeed in life? Do they look happy? And when you think about what life entails, the kind of relationships that a good life requires, the kind of career building that life requires, does lying make sense logically as a successful strategy? So you can see the consequences of vice, and you can see the consequences, at least to some extent, in some limited capacities, of virtues. It's objective. Lying is harmful. Objective, certainly as a policy. And you can then argue about borderline cases of, lies, what are called white lies, are the kind of lies that might, and you can then analyze them and show that even in borderline cases, honesty should always be the principle. Honesty properly understood. But you'd have to go through that, right? And that it's subjective. That if you violate this, you won't be successful in life. So the objective morality is about success in life. It's about all the values and the objectivist ethics and objectivist morality are objective because the standard is life. And the way to evaluate them as being good or bad is life. Life. Maybe it turns out Ayn Rand has 7 virtues. One of them is, let's say, integrity. Maybe it turns out that if you consistently practice integrity, bad things happen to you. Really bad things happen to you. Now, I'd say that's impossible, but let's just make it up, right? Then you'd have to say, oh, wait a minute, then Ayn Rand was probably wrong. Let's really dig into this concept of integrity, what it really means. There's a flaw here, there's a contradiction. Because you've got very negative consequences from what is perceived to be, or what we view as, a virtue, something that should lead to positive. What's going on here? There's some, and Ayn Rand always said, when you see a contradiction, what looks like a contradiction, check your premises. Check your premises. So I'm not going to get into we can do a show on lying, And you can bring up all your cases in which lying actually supports your life, when lying is good or whatever, and we can debate those. But right now, I'm just using this lying as the example. So certain things are good for you. Those are values. Certain things are bad for you. Those are things you want to avoid. That's objective morality. And the things that are good for you, that rise to the level of morality, are the important things, the big things, the things that really influence your life, the values that dictate everything else. Those are the moral values you should pursue, because those are the moral values that are going to lead you to to survival as a human being, and therefore to success as living. Yeah, I mean, somebody says Goebbels used astrology. Most evil people are mystics of one sort or another. Or nihilists. Those seem to be the two alternatives that evil people have. Do you think some people find religious rituals comforting, if for some reason? Yeah, I do. I think they find it comforting. It's a source of for them, kind of certainty. It's a source of. They view it as certainty. It's not certainty, of course, because it's made up stuff. But they view it as, okay, this is what's going to happen when I die. If I say these things, good thing will happen. If I say these things, bad thing will happen. That gives them certain certainty about how to live their life. It gives them what philosophy should give them, but it replaces their own thinking, and it ultimately harms them. But it gives them that approach, and that's calming. And then, the fact that there are other people who share your values is calming. The fact that there's somebody looking out for you, God is looking over you and looking out for you, is calming. So there's a lot of comforting things, but comfort is not a value. Comfort is not what leads to success in life. It depends where the comfort comes from. And comfort is not a major value to be pursued. Yeah, it's nice to be comfortable, but to comfort, and it's nice to have somebody comfort you when bad stuff happens and helps you overcome that bad stuff. But to seek out spiritual comfort as an end in itself seems wrong to me. All right. But yeah, rituals do, they make people feel less afraid. I think deep down they still stay afraid, but at some level they make them accept, the kind of Jordan Peterson perspective of suffering and death and all of that. And religion says, oh, it's not that bad, and you don't really die, and don't worry, good things will happen if you say these prayers, and if you give me $50, I'll forgive you for X number of sins, and you'll go to heaven. So it kind of gives you this pretense that things are going to be okay. The things are not as bad as they seem. But it's just a pretense. It's just lying. All right, let me just see. Can you comment on the phenomena of some people going to church once or twice a year in an effort to appear religious? Yeah, I mean, religion has a huge social attachment. That is, people feel like they should be religious even if they're not. And most people who go to church once or twice a year, go to synagogue once or twice a year, it's not that they're atheist or religious. They just don't want to think about it. It's too much of a bother. And then they go to church because it's expected. You go on Easter or you go on Christmas. You go to church because they want to be with their family, and that's it. And the rest of the time they just don't think about it. I mean, some of them might be atheists who go to church because they want to be with their family or they don't want to piss off their family off. But a lot of them are just neither atheists or not. They're just kind of secular generally in their life. But they haven't given up on religion completely. And a lot of people like that get more religious later on in life, or some of them get more religious later on in life. As they approach death and as death becomes a bigger fear factor, they become more religious. But I think a lot of people who don't have a philosophy, don't have a sense of these are my ideas and kind of this is where I belong. Church is comforting. Church is kind of nice. Church is pleasant for them, even if they don't really live it on a day-to-day basis. I was going to say, let me just say something about it. I mean, religion also provides ceremonies. It provides guideposts in life. I mean, you get a bar mitzvah, you get married, you have children. Each one of these, and somebody dies. Each one of these has a little ceremony built around it, and an attitude and a way to think about it. And I think one of the things Objectivism lacks, if you will, or has lacked in the past, is the same kind of thing, is the kind of the knowledge that there's certain monumental events, important events in one's life that should be celebrated, and creating a ritual around that celebration, or creating something to make that event sacred, to make it important, to make it substantial for people, would be cool. And, a lot of objectivists who get married write their own vows and have an objectivist marry them and create a ceremony that is meaningful to them. And I think that's beautiful and great. And I think over time, I wouldn't be surprised if we had a repository of all the different kind of wedding vows that people use in objectivist weddings, and that become a resource for people who are about to get married. And then ultimately, it would be nice if there was some, what do you say when somebody's died, and what do you say over a grave, and given that there's no afterlife, given that you're not talking to God, given that you're not talking to the person because they're dead, what do you say? How do you celebrate? Because I think funerals like that should be celebrations. How do you celebrate the life? How do you use the opportunity of a funeral to celebrate the life of the person who's died? And maybe there's some texts and rituals that will develop out of that. And maybe there is a point in having something for a young adult to celebrate the fact that they're becoming an adult. There's a meaning to having a bar mitzvah, or having something that symbolizes you are now approaching adulthood, or are an adult. Most cultures have that, and maybe there would be some kind of objectivist ceremony about that. No, circumcision would not be part of that. So it would be, I do think that's something that will come as the objectivist community and movement grow, as it becomes more substantial, because I think it's helpful. I mean, one of the things that this person who wrote me, I started the discussion about this person who wrote me this note, and one of the things he mentioned was, well, what do you do in these situations? And they're not situations where where your mind is in a position and your emotions in a position to reinvent the wheel, to rethink, to figure it out. It's appealing to go to something pre-prepared. What do you do when somebody dies? What do you do when there's a tragedy? What do you do when something's really hard? How do you deal with it? How have other people dealt with it? There should be texts about that. How to use reason, how to use rationality to deal with those kind of situations, and how do we create texts, ceremonies, rituals that help people overcome those kind of situations without losing grasp of reality, without losing grasp of objectivity of the facts. Okay, so not as a form of evasion, but of a form of engagement with the actual facts. All right, I'm getting this. I got this question twice, so thank you for giving me money twice. I appreciate it. I was going to get to this question anyway. I'm fascinated by religious people's neutral or even negative view of money. Can you please discuss this? I've read Dan Coney's money speech at least a dozen times, and it's beautiful. Yes, it is amazingly beautiful. To really understand religious people's negative view of money, partially Dan Coney explains it, but I would also encourage you to read an essay I wrote on usury, on the history of usury. It's in my book, The Moral Case for Finance. But also, if you look online, I think there's a free copy of at least a version of it that you can find, or there might be a free copy, I'm not sure, I think it's free. So just put usury Yaron Brook. We're going to the history of money lending, and I show how, to a large extent, people's attitude towards bankers and money was determined by certain stuff that was said in the Old Testament. I certainly think that it had to do, it's not irrelevant that Jesus told us the money changes out of the temple. It's not an accident that, God tells the Jews that charging interest is a mortal sin. At least charging interest from people who are your brothers is a mortal sin. It's not an accident that Dante places moneylenders in the seventh rung of hell. I think it's the seventh. And that, by the way, with a bag of money around their neck, dragging them towards the fire, pulling them down towards the fire. But essentially, I would say this. Money and seeking money as a reward for productivity is fundamentally egoistic. It's fundamental. I mean, you're striving towards attaining money in order to satisfy your needs, to satisfy your material needs, and in seeking pleasure in life. You're going after money because you're going after life. Money is one way to do that, right? Money is an essential way to do that. You can't survive without some money. Money is also a measure of success. A success of what? Success of actually achieving your values. Values for what? Values for life. Whose life? Your life. So money is a reflection of egoism. It's a reflection to some extent, and this comes out in the money speech. It's a reflection of your individual pursuit of your values. So it doesn't surprise me that a philosophy that embraces altruism, embraces the idea you should live for others, embraces the idea that your life is nothing if it's not in service of other people. That sacrifice, self-sacrifice, is the most noblest thing you can do. It is not a surprise to me that a philosophy like that, a religion like that, would hate money, would reject money, would view money as the root of all evil, or at the very best, view money as, just bland, nothing, ammo. Okay? I mean, money represents your time, your energy, your effort in achieving your values. Values that are materially tradable, that are tradable. That's what money reflects. It's the value of the values you've created. And that's very egoistic. That's very selfish. And the Christian morality rejects all of that. And of course, making money off of money is the most selfish thing you can do. And therefore the most evil of all the things you can do. All right, please, no more Super Chat questions. Save them for Saturday. I'm going to wrap up with these ones. What did Ayn Rand mean when she said, "I'm not brave enough to be a coward. I see the consequences too clearly"? And this goes back to lying, right? The idea is lying can sometimes make you feel better because you've avoided pain. So somebody asks you a question, and you know that by answering them honestly, they will be mad at you. And you don't want the stress of that. It's unpleasant when people are mad at you. They don't want you to argue with you. They don't want you to be angry with you. So you tell them the lie, right? To reduce the stress in the moment. Ayn Rand would say, I know the consequences of this lie long term. And they're horrible. So reducing the stress right now can't be worth those consequences. Not that you go through that transaction because you have a principle, do not lie. But the reason you have a principle, do not lie, is the consequences are horrific to you. So I understand the long-term consequences too clearly to lie today, even though it reduces my stress today. And that's the same thing. What are the consequences of being a coward? Lack of self-esteem, not achieving your values, lack of integrity. I mean, bravery is, I think, a sub-virtue of integrity. If you don't have integrity, you're not living up to your own word, you're not up to living up to your own ideas, you're not living in accordance with reality. That is disastrous. Being a coward, therefore, is not doing those things. That's disastrous. I know the consequences. It's horrible to be a coward. The danger, the damage of being a coward far exceeds the risk of being brave. Of being brave. Cowards don't live to go home. Cowards don't get to marry the girl because the girl doesn't want a coward. Now, again, context. Bravery doesn't mean rushing towards a bullet, particularly not when the war is not your war. Bravery does not mean suicide. But cowards live awful, pathetic, little, small, insignificant lives. People who really live, again, objectivism doesn't want you just to survive, just to get a girl. It wants you to get the girl. It wants you to live the life. It wants you to live the best life you can live. And to do that, you have to be brave. And you have to embrace life. And you have to be willing to take risk. And if you don't, yeah, you might get a girl. You might have a job. You might have a life. But it won't be a good life. It won't be a fun life. It won't be an exciting life. It won't be a life worth living. You got one shot at this. Not 2, not 3. There's no incarnation, not 14. You got 1. And that's it. You got to be brave. And life puts lots of challenges in front of you. And if you can't challenge them, right? Cowards are not taking control over their own lives. They're defaulting to somebody else having control over their lives. Now again, bravery does not mean we think of bravery in terms of military bravery. Oh, I'm going to jump out of the thing and jump on the grenade. And no, I mean, bravery is not being reckless and stupid and sacrificial and all of that. It means standing up for what you believe in the face of opposition. All right. Sagan has a way, I mean, it means more than that, but striving towards your values in the face of opposition, in the face of difficulty. It's not about dying. I mean, it's about taking risk. Wait, this is not relevant. Okay, can you explain materialism versus objectivism? I think so. Okay, so materialism basically asserts that all that exists is the material stuff in the world out there. That's it. And therefore, everything is just stuff. It's just material. Objectivism doesn't make that statement. Objectivism basically says that there's something that's not material in the world. And that something that's not material is consciousness. And consciousnwhat is not just a thing, a passive thing, an insignificant thing that's just a consequence of material stuff. I mean, we don't know what consciousness is from a biological, physical sense, scientific sense. What we do know is consciousness is a faculty of awareness, that we have awareness of the world. It's irrelevant it's not irrelevant, but it is irrelevant. I mean, it's interesting where that awareness comes from, how we get that awareness, but there is awareness. There is consciousness. There is free will. There are choices that are being made. There is another element that manipulates material. And there's a consciousness at the level of an animal that is acting in the world, that is goal-directed, that is striving towards certain things. And then there's a more advanced consciousness, which is a human consciousness that actually can choose between alternatives and can manipulate the material world. They can change nature. Indeed, the way in which human beings survives is by adapting nature to our own needs. So objectivism doesn't view the world as just atoms colliding. And everything needs to be explained in terms of atoms or quantum mechanics or whatever. I mean, I don't know what exactly is out there, but clearly there's a consciousness. And clearly consciousness can't be explained away just from the material nature of things. And one day we'll know more about consciousness, but it's still true that consciousness is something more than just a collection of atoms that the biological entity has. I mean, when you listen to a piece of music, the emotion that evokes, the place that it takes you from a consciousness perspective, cannot simply be explained by atoms and chemicals and so on. There's something more going on. Now, what is that? I don't know. Doesn't really matter. I can introspect and see it. And you can't explain it away with science. Just like you can't explain away free will. I observe free will. I see free will. I know I have free will. You can't tell me, well, atoms don't behave that way and explain away free will. I mean, I don't care how atoms behave. I have it. So just because you don't have an explanation for it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And of course, materialists often reject consciousness. And Marx's labor theory of value viewed the essence of what is created as being a product of physical, material labor. And what Marx and all of it materialists reject is the idea of the mind, creativity. And of course, in modern times, they try to explain it in terms of our DNA and our genes, and creativity is just our DNA playing out. But that's nonsense. It's bullshit. I think the technical term is bullshit. It's just not true. And you know that by, again, observing your own processes, observing yourself, observing your own mind. I'm not afraid to say, I don't know. I don't know. Right? We can define life, but do we know how life works? What is the tipping point between non-life and life and how to create it? We don't. So say, I don't know. And certainly with consciousness, we don't know. And free will, how do you get free will? I mean, how did it come about? How does it work? I don't know, but it does. And to reject it is ridiculous. I mean, how can you even think about it? How can the human species even think about what it's thinking if it's not thinking, which means if it's not applying, if it's not choosing to use its mind in a particular way? All right. Okay. Thoughts on L1, Hubbard, and Scientology. Are there any positives, rational aspects to it? No, it's complete. I mean, I read Dianetics years and years and years ago because I don't know, somebody said, read it, there's some interesting stuff here. I read it. And yeah, there's some basic, crude, simplistic, Dianetics is the book L1 Hubbard wrote and is the basis for Scientology. I read, and what did it have? It basically had the basic, the basic kind of self-help stuff that pretty much any self-help book has. Didn't have anything particularly original. Didn't have anything particularly interesting. And then it had some interesting. I guess it had some interesting stuff, but it wasn't original. Nothing I read there was original. And then I got to the part with the aliens, and it was just absurd. It was just nutty. So there are probably hundreds of self-help programs out there that do just as good of a job as Scientology does, without the mysticism and the science fiction and the nonsense and the cult aspect to it and the religious aspect to it. So what Scientology does is it turns self-help into religion. And that's just, so it brings in this mystical element. And that's just destructive. So whatever good the self-help part does, the cultiness and the religiosity, the mysticism undo. Net, it's a negative. All right, what else? All right. These are the two first questions I've left the last, but here is the second to last one. Christianity isn't going to M2. M2 is integration, authoritarianism. That's a statement you're making. Okay, maybe true, maybe not. The alt-right is M2, just like Nazi Germany. Christianity only played a supporting role. It was not the primary. Yeah, but you're assuming M2 is a misintegration, a consistent misintegration around a non-objective principle. In the case of Christianity, it would be around religion, around God. In the case of the alt-right, it would be around a different form of mysticism, about racial mysticism and nationalism or whatever. I think you're wrong on two counts. I don't think there would be an alt-right without Christianity. I think Christianity and religion, as I said earlier, fundamentally constitute a moral and epistemological authoritarianism. So they train the mind to accept authoritarianism. They're collectivists and tribalists. That's what Christianity inculcates, particularly modern Christianity with all its little tribes and all its little sects and everything. And the alt-right is just a manifestation of that same kind of mysticism and collectivism and authoritarianism taken from Christianity, applied to race and nationalism and so on. I don't think Nazi Germany could have come up without a strong Christian foundation in Germany, which Kant exploited and comes through Kantian philosophy. And I think it certainly cannot be successful in the United States without Christianity. But then the question is, what is long-term going to dominate? And I still think the alt-right, white nationalism, anti-Semitism are still, while racism is out there as political, cultural forces, while they are much, 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 much stronger today than they were 20 years ago, and even 5 years ago, I think because of Trump, they're much stronger today. And because of the left, because the backlash against the left, they are still minor forces in America. I think the much more major force is Christianity. And I just read an article, and I'm going to do a show on this because I haven't read the article thoroughly, but I want to. An article from a Harvard study that shows that actually, in spite of everything that we're told, religious people in America are becoming more religious. And yes, it's true that the non-affiliate and atheists are growing, but the Christians who are Christians are becoming more Christian. And their numbers are staggering. And many of them are turning away from the more secular, super mega churches to more religiously fundamentalist, kind of real Christianity, I would call it, than the kind of God wants you to make a lot of money and be happy and be successful, which was a complete Americanization and secularization of Christianity by these mega churches. People are moving away from that because it's a sellout. They realize the real Christianity. And they're moving towards a much more fundamentalist Christianity. And I still think Christianity is going to be the M2 that dominates, the misintegration, that gains political power, and that is the authoritarian force behind the left or the right. And who knows, because I don't know that there's a bigger difference between the left or the right these days. But it could be the force behind an alt-right like nationalism. It could be the force behind a prudish, conservative Christianity. It could be the force behind a environmentalist-focused religiosity of the left. And even the left is seeking something to integrate all their ideas around, the ones that are not complete nihilists, and environmentalism is the kind of religion of integration there. But I still think Christianity is going to be the thing that is what people will integrate around. And I think at the end, even the alt-right will adopt Christianity as the way in which to attain political power, if they can ever attain political power. So the question is not who's M2 and who isn't. The question is, fundamentally, who among the M2s can gain political power? And I think Christianity, no doubt, is best positioned to do that. Okay, here's an unrelated question. Why hasn't North Korea collapsed like Soviet Union? Why have the communists been more successful in maintaining power in North Korea than they have elsewhere, anywhere else they've had power? I mean, it's a good question. This is my attempt at an answer, and I'm not sure this is going to be completely satisfying. First of all, what do you mean by collapse? By them losing political power, yes, North Korea hasn't collapsed in that sense. But North Korea is collapsed in a sense that millions and millions and millions of North Koreans have died of starvation, and the rest are basically slaves. And that life, there is no life. There is no life in North Korea. There's no human life in North Korea. It's sick. You know, one of the reasons I was so horrified and disgusted by Donald Trump's groveling before the dictator in chief, the murderer in chief of the North Korea Communist Party. It just was disgusting and sickening to see. So as North Korea has been, the only success has been that the Communist Party is still in power. I think it hasn't collapsed because it is so primitive. It is so backward. It is so closed off to any Western influence, and always has been. So think about Russia. In spite of Russia always being kind of a mystical country, in spite of Russia being dictatorial under the czars, Russia absorbed huge amounts of Western civilization during the 19th century. So St. Petersburg was a very Western city and was built by a westernizing czar. And so there was a lot of Western art that flowed into Russia. I mean, you couldn't have a Dostoevsky and a Tchaikovsky and a Tolstoy without massive Western influences, Western ideas, Western philosophies in pre-communist Russia. So those ideas were there underground in spite of communism. There were always dissidents. There were always people who had better ideas, who remembered the past, who maybe saved some books. And then later, there were a few people who actually traveled out of the country, who saw what was going on. Maybe there were Olympic teams, maybe there were athletes, maybe they were scientists who went to conventions and everything. And they were followed and they were tracked to make sure they went home. But they saw the West. They saw what was going on. It wasn't complete darkness. North Korea has none of that. They don't have a history with the Western ideas. They don't have people who've gone to the West and come back, except for maybe the ruling family. They don't have the books. They've been kept under real control. So again, there's no technology. There's no internet. There's no television. Not to the outside world. There's probably very little radio where they can actually access South Korea. I mean, one of the things that I was told in Eastern Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe, which was much more exposed to Western ideas even than the Soviet Union, so they had some kind of foundation. They would go to the border, like in Hungary, they would go to the border with Austria or Germany, and they would turn on the radio and catch Western radio, and then some of them would have cassette players and they would record the music and bring it back and multiply the cassettes and give them to friends. I don't think that really exists in North Korea. Or to the extent that it exists, it's much more minor. But I think it's that influence of Western civilization was never in North Korea. Now, even in China, there was more Western influence. And it was expressed through the fact that the West had a real presence in China in the 19th century and the early 20th century. The Chiang Kai-shek, the fascist who was fighting the communists, was influenced by Western ideas, and Shanghai was a very cosmopolitan place. And indeed, many of the members of the Communist Party of China, and it was a big Communist Party, were trained in I traveled in the world, had seen other parts of the world, and knew something about other countries. And then they got lucky in terms of who the leadership was once Mao Zedong died. In North Korea, they've managed, because of their isolation, and I think, another thing, I'll give you one other thing, and then I'm going to call it a night. The one other aspect of this is, the North Korea is sustained today by the Russians and the Chinese. So, they trade with them, they get aid from them to some extent. Russia and China, for a variety of reasons, have an interest, a geopolitical interest, in keeping the Americans occupied by having a North Korea. And the flip side of that is not having an American presence on their border quite as close. So one of the reasons China doesn't want North Korea to unite with South Korea as a democratic free country is that they don't want American influence right on their border, right there. And the Russians don't want it either. So both superpowers have both powers have a real interest in keeping North Korea where it is right now. They don't want them to get too powerful because then they're a threat to them, but they want them powerful enough to keep the Americans away, to keep the South Koreans from integrating with North Korea, to keep the South Koreans from taking over the North. That's the goal of the Chinese and the Russians. They don't care one way or the other about the North Korean people. They could all starve to death as far as they're concerned. What they want to do is keep the American troops from the Chinese and Russian borders. And one of the many reasons I would argue to get all the troops out of South Korea and to abandon our treaty with South Korea in terms of defending them is partially to get that. Well, no, it's not to get that, but I think one of the side effects of that would be ultimately to reduce the perception of threat to those regimes. Now, I still think they don't want a strong, successful, free, powerful Korea as a neighbor. But at least it takes the American element somewhat out of it. I mean, South Korea is a rich enough society to defend itself. It's a rich enough society to wipe out, to win a war against North Korea if they invested in their military and didn't just rely on America. And there's absolutely no reason for Americans to be sacrificing for the sake of Koreans. All right, I think that is a day. I'm sure there are other things to say about atheism that I didn't say. It's a rich topic. Certainly there are other things to say about religion that I didn't say that I could have said. If you have more questions about these issues, feel free to ask me in the next opportunity for Super Chat. I hope you enjoyed the show today. If you did, share. And of course, if you enjoy watching videos on this channel, please support me at yaronbrook.com/support. Follow me on Facebook. Follow me on Twitter. And I think that's about it, right? Subscribe, please. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. And I'll see you all soon. Thanks, everybody. Bye.